All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are doing another show today with somebody I'm excited to talk with. We have Professor Ruth Milkman. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are
It's
you?
it's really good to have you. Your work speaks for itself, and it's really exciting to have you on the show. Um, you are one of the leading American labor sociologists specializing in work, labor movements, and immigration. You made this your main focus, starting at an early age. You saw mom didn't want to cross the picket line. Is that true?
How did you know that? That's absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, people always ask me, how did you get interested in this obscure topic, And I do think my mom was a big influence on it. She was a kind of 1930s style radical who, didn't really have any place to put her commitments because we lived in a small town. But anyway, once we were visiting New York, and indeed there was a picket line, and she said, "We're not going in there." So I think that was. I mean, maybe there's something else, but that's the first thing I remember where I got to find out what labor unions were.
Well, it's kind of awesome because this was a time too that this is back when communists and anarchists could still have a party then where you could vote for them and stuff like that, and they would
I'm
organize.
not that old, but she was.
30s, the
I think
30s though,
30s,
yeah.
yeah, for her. I mean, this happened in the 60s, I think, or something like
Sure.
that. I was born in 1954, so I know I'm old, but I'm not quite that old.
You're not old. My neighbor's old. He's old. You're not old. Um,
It's a good time to be old right now, given what's happening in the world, I must say.
yeah,
But
checking out and saying, "Good luck with all of that, kids." Yeah, I myself, I have a few more years left, maybe if I'm lucky. Doesn't look good. The future ain't what it used to be, as they say. Um, so now you've been at UCLA, UC Berkeley, you've been all over the place. What's your latest work? Is it Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat? Is that the latest?
that's the name of the last book I published. Yes.
Okay. So just so folks know if they want to check out some of your work and stuff. Very important work. So here we go. You're in the hot seat now. Let's go with the questions. In your article, A New Political Generation, you explore how post 2008 movements like Occupy and BLM intersected with renewed union activism. So, what distinguishes this generation of activists from previous ones, and how is it reshaping labor's future? Where are we?
So that article actually didn't talk much about labor, but I'll explain that. It was published back in 2017, and at that time, labor was not like a major part of the agenda of this generation. But let me say what I argued in the article and then update it. So in the last decade, things have changed quite a bit to include a much more sustained focus on labor issues. What I try to argue in that piece is that the generation that came of age in the 21st century, and that's a mix of millennials and now Gen Z, were very different from older generations in a couple of ways. One was that they were the first digital natives. People my age had to learn about the internet and lived in a world as adults without it before it existed. We were talking before about how I'm getting old. This is how it was. But that wasn't true for millennials and Gen Z, obviously. You guys, uh, it was just there already, and you took it for granted, and you were therefore more skilled at using it, which is important in social movements because a lot of these movements, especially Occupy Wall Street, exploited digital media in a very effective way. So anyway, that's one thing. More important probably is that this generation came of age in a period when the economy was in bad shape, and the labor market in particular was in crisis. I'm referring to the great financial crisis of 2008 and the so-called Great Recession that followed. And many of the young people of this generation came of age just as all that was happening. And especially those who went to college, graduated from college, did everything they had been told would secure them a spot in the middle class or something like that, instead confronted that labor market. So that was a radicalizing influence on a lot of people who were, they did everything right, and then instead they could get a job at a, you know, coffee shop or part time or something, or retail job or whatever. Um, Also, this was a generation that was somewhat disillusioned by other things that had promises that were broken. Um, they were told they had come of age in a post-racial order. Obama became the president and so on. And yet they confronted, police brutality against Black people and other forms of racism regularly. They were also told it was an era where gender equality had been achieved and, feminism wasn't really necessary anymore. And then they saw their friends be sexually assaulted on campuses and things like that. So in all those ways, this generation had, pretty distinct set of experiences that set them apart from their predecessors. And that eventually galvanized them into social movement activity. The first one I noticed was Occupy Wall Street, which was led by college-educated millennials, basically. But it turns out things like Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, if you remember that phenomenon of the immigrant youth who were trying to figure out a path to legalization. These were mostly young people who had been brought to the U.S. as kids by their parents. And there was this thing called the Dream Act, which led to DACA. Anyway, that's another example. There was also the sort of predecessor of Me Too was a campus-based anti-sexual assault movement that also was led by these folks. And there was some labor activity too, kind of in the background, but especially on college campuses, organizing graduate student workers and adjuncts and stuff like that. But it really wasn't until 2020 that became central. Oh, and I forgot to mention one of the key things that led to that, which was the Bernie Sanders campaigns for president. Right. So many of the Occupy activists migrated into, well, Occupy didn't last very long, even though I think it had a huge impact on the political conversation of this country. Many of the activists in Occupy then moved on to work for Sanders. And Sanders proclaimed himself openly as a socialist, and so did many of them. And so then we saw the growth of things like DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and pretty soon more intense focus on labor issues among this same generation. So that's what I was on about. And after the pandemic began, this really sort of blossomed because the early 2020s set up really good conditions for labor activism. There was the pandemic itself, which put a spotlight on so-called essential workers. Remember that? It seems so long ago now, but sort of, making more and more people aware of the kind of abuses that occur in low-wage work. So that was one factor. And probably an even bigger one. Well, the pandemic itself made us all understand that life is short and that, we need to make it into a better world and all that. That was
and that your existence is predicated upon the labor of like thousands of people.
Exactly. So that was one thing that sort of raised people's awareness, or yes. And then at the same time, the pandemic created a pretty severe labor shortage, which still hasn't completely disappeared, which meant that if you were a young worker who had one of those precarious jobs as a barista or whatever, and you organized a union and got fired for it, which happens all the time, even though that is against the U.S. law, not that big a deal in that labor market because there were so many jobs going begging. People could easily find another job in a coffee shop or something equivalent to that. So that, sort of took away one of the things that has made labor organizing difficult for folks, which is fear of being fired. And it's a justifiable fear. So combining all that with the kind of radical awakening that many of these young folks had before 2020 led to a big upsurge of new organizing of unions, especially in places like Amazon, Starbucks, Apple stores, Trader Joe's, things like that. And then with less fanfare, or with less media attention, I should say, it continued on, among other, in other workplaces, among, I already mentioned adjuncts, that they continued to organize very, very strongly, and graduate student workers, but also museum workers, people working in nonprofits, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a lot of that activity in recent years, and almost all of it. And journalists are another group I should mention, since you are one, or something like that, have also been unionizing a lot. Healthcare workers, it sort of took off in the 2020s. Although now that we have some changed conditions, of course, with the new administration that are likely to put a damper on all that. But the last few years have been quite unusual in that regard. And it's all been led by that generation.
And it's kind of snowballing because things aren't really getting better. And so I think you're right. 2020 was one of these moments where they had to educate themselves on what to do because Bernie Sanders we couldn't get the change we wanted. BLM sort of petered out, and then before that it was Occupy, and that petered out. And so people have to, I think people are starting to see that it starts with your individual actions the best you can, and then you have to then organize beyond that. And then, but it's tough. It's tough in this capitalist hellscape right now
It is.
to get a grip. So
Well,
you
one
had,
of the other things, if I could just add one more thing I should have mentioned before,
yeah,
the other thing that we had in the 2020s was the Biden administration after starting in 2021, and he appointed a very active and progressive woman called Jennifer Abruzzo to head the National Labor Relations Board, which many people had given up for dead in the labor movement, but she really reinvigorated it. And so that was another factor. And, he himself, Biden, was a labor-friendly guy relative to what came before and since. So that was just one more thing that made this helped promote all this activity.
yeah, relative's the key term, not
Sure.
relative
No,
to.
and yes, absolutely. And I should say that it was not enough to really move the needle in terms of the percentage of workers who are unionized in this country, which remains lower than it's been in a century. So that even though there was a lot of stuff happening, still is, and a lot of it was successful and got tremendous public attention, media attention, only 6% of private sector workers in the United States are union members today. And that it's actually slightly lower in 2024 than it was the year before, though only like 0.1% or something. Not,
Yeah.
But the point is that all this activity did not succeed in turning that ship around.
One of the only unions that is remarkably strong is the police unions, where they're about as strong as the AFL-CIO when they were in their day.
Well, the police unions are not a new phenomenon, and that's not really what I'm talking about. They've been around for a long time. Not just police, but other uniformed public employees like firefighters and whatnot are very highly unionized. They actually have come under attack to some extent here and there because of, not because of, for the reasons you are imagining, I don't think, but because public sector unionism has actually been less affected than private sector by all the things that have led to that 6% figure. And but then there was a Supreme Court decision in 2018, it may not be the right year, but around then, called the Janus decision, which created a new set of a new legal situation for workers in the public sector, who prior to that had an arrangement where they could, this is very inside baseball, but where they basically paid what were called agency fees, which are essentially union dues, whether or not they joined the union. That is no longer permitted after this decision. And so it hasn't had as big an impact as you might have expected on union density in the public sector, but it has had some. And that's a kind of, looming specter in the public sector unionism, including the uniformed.
So public to private, obviously the private sector is the one where where it's harder to unionize and the workers get screwed more. That's what you're saying.
It's sort of, yes, and it's sort of obvious why that is. I mean, in the private sector, it's profit driven, and employers have figured out all kinds of ways to attack unions, and they've been very successful since roughly you're not old enough to remember this, but in 1981 there was this big strike of the air traffic controllers.
Oh, I was there.
Okay, so you must have been quite young, but that was a big deal. And what happened was the president at the time was Ronald Reagan, and he fired them all. It was an illegal strike, but there had been plenty of other federal workers going on strike, and that had not happened in any time that anybody could remember. So that was often seen as a big turning point. Of course, what we have now with Trump attacking federal workers unions is sort of, as somebody said at a conference I just attended, Patco on steroids. I mean, it hasn't gotten the same level of publicity actually, but that's what's underway right now. So that's not a good situation. But anyway, in the aftermath of Patco, private sector unionism went into a relentless decline with only a few interruptions. And whereas the public sector was flat until recently. So, but that may change now, and it has changed a little since that Supreme Court decision.
Interesting. Because I've heard bad things about the post office unions being corrupt. Do they, like, we have regulatory capture and stuff? Does this happen to the public unions at all, or?
What do you mean by we have regulatory capture? I'm
Well,
sorry.
the regular corporations come in and they capture the regulatory bodies and make them pretty
Oh, I
much
see what you're
do.
saying. Yeah,
But
yeah.
do the corporations come in and do that to the unions of the public sectors? I assume that even though
Not
it's
exactly, but what they have captured is the National Labor Relations Board to a great extent. That's what Abruzzo, who I mentioned before, who was Biden's National Labor Relations Board, tried to do something about that and made some dents in that whole situation. But now we're back to where we were, because Trump, she's gone, and Trump also fired what most people argue illegally another member of the board who was similarly inclined, and so now he's installed his people there. And but even before that, the reason people had given up that agency for dead was exactly what you just described. Look, corruption has been an issue in some unions over the years, but as we all know, every institution in this society is plagued with corruption. And I would argue that corporate corruption exists on a much grander scale than what we've seen in the labor movement. That doesn't make it okay.
Not to say that labor is a bad thing or unions are a bad thing. It's just that we need to make sure that unions are doing their jobs and not being overtaken and then neutralized for the sake of whatever our corporate overlords want us to do.
They don't want to capture them. They want to destroy them. That's what the private sector overlords are interested in. So they're trying. So far, labor refuses to die. But 6% in the private sector compared to in the heyday of organized labor in the United States, it was up to 35%. So that's quite a decline.
Speaking of the numbers, you had a 2023 analysis of the State of the Unions. It paints a detailed picture of the labor's gains and losses in NYC and beyond. What did you find in this data about the union?
Well, it's funny you should mention that. I've done it for many years, and for 15 years here in New York, and prior to that, when I was at UCLA, we did similar kind of analysis of the data every Labor Day. So there's another one about to come out where I don't know when this is going to be online, but we were broadcasting it in late August, and so we've written the one for 2025. It's just not out yet. We'll release it around Labor Day.
Cool.
So this is more like something that I do. My co-author is a PhD student at the CUNY Graduate Center, where I also teach, but we do this as a kind of public service. The data are public data collected by the now infamous Bureau of Labor Statistics on a monthly basis. And so anybody can access the data, but the published data are very limited. And so what we do is look at the unpublished data and analyze it in detail with a focus on New York, especially New York City, New York State, and the country, to just analyze like the demographic trends in among union members, which industries are more unionized than others, which occupations, how it breaks out by race, gender, et cetera. So that's what it is. And each year we do a special feature on, just one topic that we go into a little more depth on. And the one that we're about to release, that topic is actually immigration and the labor movement. But it's, we do something different every year. I don't remember what it was in 2023, actually. But what you described is in all of them. And then we have like a sort of, centerfold or whatever with somewhere zeroing in on a particular issue. So like I said, we chose immigration this year, which I guess it's sort of obvious what the reasons for that are, given what's going on right now.
Somebody has to stick up for these people.
Well, and some unions are, but what people don't know, and that we try to emphasize in that part of the report that is about to come out, is that immigrant workers are actually almost as unionized nationally as the U.S.-born workforce. And in New York City, they're actually slightly more unionized. Which most people are aware of. So that was not true in 1970, but it is now. So we try to look at, what the reasons for that are and what it might imply. And unions are sticking up for immigrants in some industries. Maybe they could do more. I think they could, but we have seen some examples of that. Like that guy, Kilmar Abrego, if you remember that case, who was arrested. He was a sheet metal worker in Maryland, and he was sent to El Salvador. It was this big deal case that was one of the, big political stunts that the Trump people executed. So he was a union member in Maryland, and his union has defended him. He's actually, he was released and sent and came back to the United States from that place in El Salvador where Trump was sending people. And but they've cooked up some other charges against him. So that story isn't quite over yet, but it's just one example. So obviously not all immigrants are unionized, but neither are most US born workers. Unions are one of the few institutions that does defend them in situations like that. So
yeah, I mean, obviously, who else would do that? That's wild. What are the implications of having more representation for immigrants in New York City in unions? Than is it just because of they're being used as cheap labor for?
Well, there is a lot of that, but those are not the ones who are unionized. So New York has been an immigrant magnet for decades and decades, actually centuries. I'm sure everyone listening to this must know that. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a huge wave of immigrants in New York. The famous garment workers were all immigrants in those days, for example. We don't have too many garment workers anymore, but we still have plenty of immigrant workers these days, more often in things like restaurants and hotels and construction than in manufacturing, which there's very little of in New York City. But because it's such a long-standing place that immigrants have been attracted to, LA is another one actually. There's a lot of immigrants who've been in New York for like decades. And they're the ones who find their way into the labor movement. People who, when they first show up, especially if they don't speak English well, or maybe not at all, do end up in, the bottom of the labor market often, unless they have a ton of education or something, which some immigrants do. We shouldn't forget that. There's a lot of immigrants who come to the U.S. and bring with them a tremendous amount of knowledge and, educational background. But the majority are in low-wage jobs. And those are basically outside the union sector. But the immigrants who've been here for a long time find their way up the ladder. And many of them do end up in unionized sectors. So that's the short answer to your question.
Good for them.
Yeah.
I mean, New York City is a very cultural rich city with people. I've been there a few times, and I have friends from there and stuff, and it was always overwhelming. But you have the boroughs and the different districts and the different neighborhoods and stuff, and it was always interesting.
Well, and it's also a place where unions have remained a bit stronger than in the country as a whole. So with union density, the percentage of workers who are unionized is roughly double in New York what it is nationally. That's also for sort of historical reasons, but I mean, it's a long, complicated business. But but immigrants are part of that.
I would guess the density of a place makes it so people are more aware of whether or not they're getting screwed because they can talk to their neighbors or see it. Is this true? Is there any truth to that?
Maybe, I don't know. The state that has the highest union density of any of the 50 states in this country is actually Hawaii, which isn't particularly dense, but it has a really interesting labor history. So I'm sure there's a factor of density probably helps, but there's a lot of different moving parts in this story. But it's been a center of unionism for a long, long time. But still, double the national level isn't that unionized. It's still the majority of workers, even in New York, are not unionized. So it's about 80% non-union today in New York versus 90% nationally. That's public and private sector together.
Yeah, got to bump those numbers up, guys. We got to get those numbers up.
Well, it's difficult because think about how that works. Like, okay, here's a good example. In 2021, on April Fool's Day, the workers at this warehouse of Amazon in Staten Island did vote to unionize. 8,000 people work there. It's like a nice chunk of folks. But the United States workforce is about 160 million people. So that was a very big deal. No one expected it. I didn't expect it. I really was stunned by the news. And it got tremendous attention from people generally, but especially the mass media. It was all over like, wow, Amazon unionized. How could that be? And it is a big deal, although there are two notable PSs to that. One, they still don't have any kind of contract or recognition from the company. That Amazon has been able to delay and find ways to manipulate the law to prevent that from happening. So that story remain, and that's very typical in the private sector, by the way. It's not just Amazon. They're just doing the usual thing that all big corporations do. But also it's a drop in the bucket in terms to move that needle on union density. You'd have to organize a ton of Amazon warehouses and, other things. So, because it's a big country with a lot. So, one warehouse at a time, or better example, one Starbucks barista shop at a time. Starbucks has thousands of stores in this country, and about 600 of them have now voted successfully to unionize. But that too, they each have some 50 workers at the most. So that's all the shifts put together. So it doesn't add up to that much, even though there's been a lot of attention to those successes, which again, people thought it couldn't be done, and it can. But it needs to be scaled up in a huge way, and that has not happened.
Yeah, and it just feels like they have more power than it seems, because our bargaining power isn't very good when police can come in and arrest a guy for wearing a unionized Starbucks pin on his. The cops came to a Starbucks, arrested a kid because he had some kind of regalia on that was.
I missed that one, but that's not so typical. What more often happens is that the company closes the shop, or the person gets fired, or they don't really need the police. They have found other ways to fight back, and they're pretty good at it. Until the labor law is reformed in some significant way, it remains it's not impossible, as these examples show, but it's a real uphill battle.
Might have to wait a president or two before you can.
Yeah, I would say so.
Think about it.
It's not going to happen under Trump.
You know what I did, kids? I moved to Germany. It's not much better, but it's slightly better. And
is that where you are right now?
Yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Well, here we are. Yeah.
It's not bad. Slightly better. That's what I say. Slightly better. In your dissent piece on the Amazon labor union, speaking of that, you called it a historic breakthrough, which made your campaign succeed where others had failed. What do you think was the best strategy they used? What can we learn from that we could employ elsewhere?
Well, there's a lot of different elements, but one of the things that was most impressive about it was the activism of the workers themselves. Most the leaders were actually included people who had already been fired for organizing by Amazon, but nobody could say that they were a, quote, third party, which is a common employer argument when they faced with a union organizing campaign. Oh, that union's coming in, they just want your dues money. They're not, we don't need a third party, they would say. Well, in this case, there was no established union that backed the campaign. It was created and run by Amazon workers themselves. So that argument didn't fly. And they were very creative. They did things like so this warehouse is in Staten Island, and it's hard to get to. So most, it's New York, so people don't drive. They take, some do, but many of them took buses and trains and stuff to get there. And so at the bus stop, they would hang out and talk to people as they were coming and going from work. And they offered them free food, free marijuana also for a while. They tried to, and they made it clear that they were themselves, the people doing this were their coworkers. And I think Amazon underestimated their power in that they probably could have crushed it if they had understood better what was really going on. And they did, fight back a little bit. They hired, as companies tend to do in these situations, they hired a labor consultant, otherwise known as a union buster, a law firm that specializes in trying to figure out how to fight back. But in this case, they failed. The campaign was extremely well run. And, it's a really tough place to work, Amazon. It actually pays decently, but the working conditions are really bad. And again, this was a time when the labor market was very tight. So if someone risked supporting the union, it wasn't like they couldn't find some other job easily. They could at that moment. So anyway, they kind of did everything right, which is how you win, because the companies have so much more power and so much more legal recourse than the workers do. But in this case, they did succeed in winning the election. I watched it when it occurred. They showed it on YouTube, the NLRB count of the votes. And there was a woman like my age counting these paper ballots that said, yes, no, yes, like that. It took a long time because there are 8,000 people. Yeah. I mean, it really was almost surreal, but they managed to, this creaky legal machinery that a lot of people had given up on, this organization succeeded in making it work, and to the advantage of workers. And by the way, the leaders were young, many of them of color, not all, but the most famous was this guy, Chris Smalls, who you may have heard of.
Oh, yeah.
He had been fired by Amazon, and he was determined to do this. But there were a lot of other people involved. There still are. And they're still fighting to get a contract, but it's been 4 years and a little more. So,
yeah, good for him.
Yeah.
Chris Smalls. Yeah. Steve Donziger, too. I've been trying to get him on the program as well. Yeah, we got a long way to go with this stuff. It's really disheartening to see it, but when we do have a win, it is surreal, isn't it?
Well, that was the first big one. The Starbucks stuff sort of followed. Well, it started a little before that, actually, in Buffalo, New York, and then there've been a bunch since then. But yeah, it's not easy to do. And there's a new book that I would recommend. This is somebody else you might want to interview someday. A young sociologist called Eric Blank just published a book called "We Are the Union," and it's about what he calls worker to worker organizing. And one of the things and it's about these kind of campaigns. One of the things he points out is that the availability of social media has made the cost of organizing, has reduced the cost of organizing quite substantially. So I don't know how important that was in Amazon. It probably mattered, but at the Starbucks campaign, there was one little Starbucks in Buffalo, New York that started the whole thing. And the people who worked there taught workers who were interested in replicating what they had done in other shops, and they did it all on Facebook and so on. So, which meant that, there was nobody had that campaign actually did have an established union supporting it, but they didn't have to spend money traveling around the country and teaching everybody all the rules and regulations and so on. The kids, they were mostly very young, did it themselves on social media very powerfully. And, it's not rocket science. You can learn how to do this, but normally a campaign like that where the shops are scattered all over the place would be very expensive. In this case, it wasn't. So he sees that as a kind of game changer. Again, there's a lot more that you need than just training people how to do it, but there's a lot of interest. The polling data shows that Americans support labor unions more extensively than they have since the 1960s in the 2020s. And that's particularly true of young people. So we are seeing a lot more interest in the whole thing. And another recent study that somebody did talks about what they call the union curious. That's also a phenomenon that's much greater among young workers who are actually less unionized than older workers on the whole overall, but they're interested to a pretty unprecedented degree in my lifetime anyway.
Good. We have the same statistics with 18 to 29-year-olds or something. 60%, 70%, all on board with socialism. They've seen the ills.
Yes, it's that same phenomenon. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why we started this conversation. Then I call it the new political generation, the new left, if you will. Yeah.
Good. And good for them. And they should be radicalized and take these sort of Biden era, sort of Obama era, Gen Z, people my age, and just radicalize them and make them so super far left. And this administration will definitely do that. And hopefully push it.
Well, it started way before Trump. I mean, and I don't think he gets the credit for this, but think about, I already mentioned the precarity in the labor market that so many people that age face. There's that. On top of it, they're saddled with student debt. They're facing incredibly high housing costs in major cities all over this country. I mean, the economic screws are really there in a big way. And you put that together with the, raised expectations that people got when they played by the rules, went to college, did what they were supposed to do. And it is a pretty explosive combination. And people like Sanders have educated them about, what's wrong with the system as it is now. And that has really had an impact. It's not everybody that age, obviously, but there's enough people that are, persuaded of that and have decided that they want to change the world in a serious way and are becoming activists and organizers. And so that's where all this came from. And again, the scale is still too modest to really turn things around, but it's happening. And they're not going anywhere, even though the environment is now much more hostile than it was under Biden, politically and economically. That tight labor market is going away. We've got a hostile administration, not a friendly one, but those young folks are still there and they still think what they think. So that part has not changed.
So you're a little too young for this, but as far as the momentum, you like that. As far as the momentum that they had in the 1960s and during this time, I find this to be one of the most recent developments where people still had a moment where they almost broke the the sort of machinery of the United States, the oppressive and the the malevolence. Do you think that the young people have just as much momentum as those young hippies in the 60s did?
The new left, it was called then, and some people call what's happening now the new left.
The new left.
That was, in those days it was they achieved a lot. The civil rights movement was a big part of that. The anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, which I was part of, though, even though, like you said, I was too young to be in on the ground floor, but I got there eventually. So sure, those things had a huge impact. And now we have the difference, though, to me, and maybe this is why the new left didn't focus that much on labor. A few people did, but it was pretty marginal compared to what we're seeing now. Was that we had it pretty good economically in those days, especially college graduates.
Right.
That has really changed in the last half century. And so I think part of the interest, the criticisms of capitalism and the interest in things like labor unionism reflect that dramatic change and the huge growth in inequality and in the cost of living and student debt. All those things are, adding into the drive to change things, which that was not the situation so much in the 60s. It was the peak of American prosperity. There were other problems, which haven't completely gone away, obviously. Like I said before, racism, sexism, imperialism, like the Vietnam War, and now we've got some new ones that the U.S. is very involved in. So those things are not gone, but what has changed is for young students and recent graduates, their own economic situation is very problematic too, on top of all that. So I think that's fuel for the movement.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the main reasons why people that are polled say, I don't want to have children, is because it's economically, it's not feasible for me right now.
Yeah, exactly. And housing is huge, right?
Right. This is a big part of it.
We have a socialist running for mayor here in New York City right now. You probably heard about Zoran Mamdani, who has made those issues front and center to his campaign. Affordable housing and childcare are like his top two issues. And the reason he won the Democratic primary in June was basically that all these young people came out and voted who don't usually vote in such elections. I mean, most people don't vote in primary elections, but still, it's huge. And I mean, we'll see what happens. It's not, he's the leading candidate now for the November election too, though a lot of things could change by then. But
they all said, what would you do your first day in office? They asked all the candidates, and they all said, we want to go to Israel. And he said, I'll just stay here and take care of New York. Is that okay? People hated him. They said, well, how could he say that? And then the young people were like, this is the guy. We like this guy.
And it's not just young people, but that was who put him over the top for sure in June. And now his challenge is to get everybody else on board, which I think, thanks to the egomaniacal candidates he's running against, not all of whom are running as independents and refuse to pull out, they're going to divide the more conservative voters of New York. And if nothing else changes, he's poised to win. But like I said, it's months away. A lot could happen. People are not, the establishment is not very happy about him, but he's 33 years old. So he's like a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I'm glad that New York City has sort of woken up to the idea, but there's, the politicians that we have right now is just, it's frightening. Well, I say we, but I mean, you have some pretty scary politicians.
You've jumped ship. Well, good for you, but not all of us have that option.
A couple more questions, then we got to get out of here.
Okay.
So your scholarship, especially in immigration matters and immigration labor and the new precariat, highlights the deep structural inequalities of the U.S. labor markets. What's it like day to day for immigrant workers right now in NYC?
Those things were written prior to the Trump attack on immigrant rights that we've had. So when I was writing all that, things were not as desperate as they are now. But even before, let me just give you a couple background facts that most people don't know. One is that the labor laws and the wage and hour laws, things like minimum wage laws, cover immigrants the same way they cover everybody else. There are a few minor exceptions, but basically immigrant workers have the same rights as everyone else. However, employers, and this is much more true today than it was when I wrote that stuff a few years back, insofar as they employ undocumented workers, of whom there are estimated 12 million in the United States. Some of them are children, but many of them are in the workforce, more so than the U.S. born population. They are workers. And employers who are aware of that, the fact that they've employed undocumented folks, which, by the way, is against the law for them to do, but obviously they do it, can sort of take advantage of that and make people afraid to exercise the rights that they have if they even are aware of those rights. So they are more vulnerable, all else equal, than U.S. born workers. But they also, employers love immigrants, it seems. They they have the reputation of being extremely hard workers. And partly, a lot of the reason many low-wage workers especially came to this country in the first place was to find a better life for themselves and their families economically. And part of what that means, getting back to my favorite subject here, is that they're actually more interested in organizing in unions and things like that than the U.S. born often. It's part of their general mission of trying to improve their economic fate. And they see if the opportunity comes up, which it doesn't very often, but when it does, they say, yes, that's going to help me and help my family. I'm going for it. And for them, actually, the risks that are there, this is based on research I did much earlier in the 21st century, but when, things were quite different, the ICE weren't roaming the streets of LA and stuff like that. But they had been through so much trauma by just coming to the country illegally that even undocumented immigrants saw the risks of organizing as relatively small and went for it when the opportunity was there. So that's getting back to the thing we were talking about before of why unionization rates are not that different for the immigrant workforce. It's partly because they're more interested. Fast forward to today, we have a situation where immigrants are like Jews in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. I mean, this government is viciously violating the rights that they do have. Yeah. And I think that public opinion is now turning against that. Even though Trump was elected with that as a big part of his platform, people thought he was just going to go after, immigrants who had committed crimes, serious crimes. And, there are some like that. Very few people would defend them. Some would, but that they don't have much public support. But the person who, cleans up the office where you work and is from El Salvador and has been doing this job for 15 years very well and who you're friendly with, that's not who people voted to kick out of the country. And yet that is what's happening. And so that has very much reduced, according to recent polls, support for Trump's anti-immigrant program. But it's happening. It's continuing nevertheless. So for the moment, anyway, as we speak.
And it should be noted that there's no data or evidence or proof that getting rid of immigrants helps the country out.
On the contrary.
On the contrary, it helps tremendously.
Well, we know that immigrants, for example, are less likely than U.S. born people to commit crimes. That's
true.
That's been documented over and over again. And they also contribute a lot to the economy. We don't have time to get into all the gory details, but you can, if you look into that, you'll see that virtually all economists agree on that.
Show me an American person that's going to go pick fruit in the hot sun, or
Well, there's that too. But even independent of that, they also, they provide services that make people's lives better at a big scale. And I don't know if the Trump agenda is really carried out, it's going to hurt the U.S. economy. It's already hurting it.
Yeah.
There are shortages in all sorts of fields. One of the things I'm researching at the moment is home health care workers. And it was always hard to recruit people into that job because it's very difficult and not very well paid. But a lot of the people who do it are immigrants. And insofar as there's less availability of immigrant labor, this is an occupation, demand for which is huge, by the way, as the population ages and so on, that is suffering. And that's just one example.